Welcome to In Her Voice. My name is Kelly Covert, and I am passionate about helping women live authentically by listening to their inner voice. Get ready to be inspired by women of all walks of life that have set aside their should-bes and not good enoughs and are standing in their true voice, the voice of wisdom that each and every one of us has inside. Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Her Voice, episode 26. This is Kelly Covert, and I am an inner voice coach and your host and guide as we talk to women of all walks of life about how their inner voice is guiding them. And I'm so excited to bring to you today Shirley Melis. She has written a beautiful memoir called Banged Up Heart. And this is really just a beautiful discussion that we have about how we transform through grief. She has such a beautiful way of speaking and such a beautiful way of really coming in to who she is. Even at a more mature age, Shirley really discovered herself, and she shares with us this story of how she discovered her inner voice, how she discovered literally who she was through her grief, and how she really used gratitude through all of that to keep going. It's really an inspiring story, you guys. Shirley is a longtime business writer, travel writer, and newspaper columnist who has traveled the world, interviewing everyone from busboys to heads of international organizations before launching a career in public relations in Washington, D.C. And this memoir really is a new direction for her writing. She delved deeply into her own personal story of finding love late, losing it early, and discovering the strength to choose love again. She is a graduate of Vassar, and she's really created an intimate memoir bearing eloquent witness to the kind of wild trust that can grow in the heart of an ordinary woman thrust into circumstances that few others must face. I really think that you are just going to love sitting beneath her wisdom and basking in her deliberate way of speaking, as well as the beautiful words that she has to say about how her grief changed her in a positive way. And I think that this is something that we can all learn from. We all have experienced a level of grief, and sometimes it's hard to move past that, but there are definitely ways that we can do it and tools and strategies that we can use to help us. So make sure you listen all the way to the end because it is just really, really good. And as you're listening, if you find yourself really resonating with what Shirley is saying and really nodding your head and saying, yes, this is exactly what I needed, if you could please pay that forward and share it with someone else who you think would really love to listen to this as well. All you have to do to share is hit the share button in your podcast app, whatever you might be using to listen to, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or any other podcast app. They all have a share button. Or you can just share the link, kellycovert.com/26, and that will go right to the show notes for this page where anyone can listen. So let's get right to our interview with author Shirley Melis. Shirley, I'm so excited to welcome you to In Her Voice today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Kelly.
Wonderful. So I want to just start with your story. You've had a very beautiful and heart-wrenching story that you've chosen to share in your memoir. And why don't you just briefly take our listeners through that journey?
Kelly, I was widowed 2 years when I found myself swept up into a whirlwind courtship by a younger man, a rocket scientist. Falling deeply in love, we married and started traveling as if there were no tomorrow, realizing our dreams, photography, his, writing, mine. But little more than a year later, we were fighting for his life against a rare cancer that he'd staved off for 18 years. I felt I was on a roller coaster ride unlike any I'd ever experienced. And when it ended, I wondered whether I could stand. And when I did stand, I wondered if and how I would live. I felt blindsided and had to figure out what had happened to me. And so often, writing helps me see more clearly. So I started writing. And it was, at first I thought I was just celebrating our relationship. But after I got started, I became wiser, I think, more demanding, more curious. I was curious about John's behavior toward me. Had he intentionally kept the severity of his illness a secret? I was determined to confront questions that I had never asked him. So in the end, extolling our relationship was not nearly so important as coming as close to the truth as I could. And that's how it began.
So in that moment of grief, in experiencing a loss of your second husband so soon after your first, you decided to dive into the writing. And it's curious to me and interesting that what you found was that asking the hard questions was where you found your healing. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, what gave you the courage to go to that place after all that you had experienced?
In the beginning, I hadn't read many novels. I was a history major in college, so I had a healthy regard for original sources. And I had a bushel of emails and a detailed journal. And that's what I used as I was writing. I just, in a sense, was reliving that experience. And I wanted to get it all down. I wanted it to get it right. But I didn't know I had an inner voice. I've got to tell you that at that point, when I finished my first draft, and that was after I shared it with my goddaughter, who's an author in her own right, and she said, "Oh, other people, Shirley, will want to read this." And I thought, really? Well, I'd better go the distance and make it worthwhile. So she said, "But you ought to include your first husband." And so I did that. And then I'd say, well, of my philandering Greek lover, my troubled mother. So I had a huge manuscript after 3 years, but I felt something was missing. I didn't know what. And at that point, I met an editor, Morgan Farley, and handed her the manuscript. She called 2 weeks later saying, "I know exactly what's missing." And she said, "For starters," so we met again, "for starters, you have 4 books in one." So she said, "I've made a note of how many pages are in each." And she says, "I suggest you go with the one with the most pages because I think that's where your energy is." So with a number of pages discarded, I learned that memoir is not a beginning to end autobiography. It's a limited time. It's a slice of life with a limited scope of time and a unifying theme. And my theme was finding love late, losing it too soon, and choosing to love again. Well, that said, there was still a lot missing, and I had a rather steep learning curve. But one of the things that I learned was that I had just told what I'm calling the visible story. There was a lot of action, and it was wrenching at times, but it wasn't the inside story. And with Morgan's questions, and they were very simple questions, such as, she had the manuscript. We would go chapter by chapter. She would say, "What were you feeling? Or how did you feel about that? I mean, it was, she guided me inside so that I really submerged myself. I was able to submerge myself in the moment that needed to be re-experienced, that I needed to re-experience, so that the feelings were no longer suppressed, but expressed.
Yeah. And so you said that you didn't feel like you knew you had an inner voice before that time.
True, I didn't. And because of this, it was through the rewriting and bouts of free expression with a pad of paper on my lap and a pen in my hand that I went deep and just wrote without editing, just wrote, and then came out and looked at it and went on. Because I was a presenter in a memoir writing conference this past weekend, and I was sharing 9 lines of my original draft that it was the night of the day that my husband John died. And I had written something to the effect, I hardly slept that night. And, I got up, I found the wedding album, and then I opened the bedside drawer and pulled out the email that he'd sent me before we were married and wept. And I knew my heart was irreparably broken. And that was the end. Well, that was a moment that I really needed, as Morgan would say, to unpack it. I'm sure I was in my red chair with a notepad on my lap and pen in hand. And I went through I just remembered every moment, the way the condo was. It was so eerily quiet. I could hear nothing, not even the sound of the AC at some point. And it turned out to be 2 pages, not 9 lines, in which I re-experienced my feelings and my actions that night.
That's so beautiful. And I think I'm a huge proponent of journaling. It's funny because I sit down, I journal all the time, and I don't necessarily call it writing. I just call it journaling, but it is writing. And what do you think it is about writing that gets to the depth of who we are and of what we're feeling and helps us to understand that?
Well, that's a question I've often asked. I should say that my first draft I was at the computer, that I wasn't writing using my hand, I was at the computer keys. And Kelly, I don't really know if somehow there's a connection that seems to unlock the subconscious in a way when pen is in hand. And I don't know more than that. There's someone by the name of Barclay Braden she may be the originator of depth journaling, but she talks about journaling with the non-dominant hand.
I've heard of this.
I've tried that at times, and it seems to unlock the subconscious. It's I don't know. How do you answer that question?
You're turning the question back around on me. I think that there's just something that releases. For me, I am able to get all of the thoughts out of my head. And then once they're all gone, all that's left is my inner voice. And all I have to do is listen and write that down. And sometimes it's not even listening. It just flows out of my pen. And then I go back and read it. It's almost like you said, it's like you don't even realize what you're writing. And then you go back and read it, and it's so full of wisdom, and it's so loving, and it's so gentle, and it's exactly what I needed to hear in that moment. And that's why I value that practice so much of journaling, because for me, it's really how I connect in to my inner voice and find that courage to move through fear that I have, to find the courage to move through grief like you did, and to really live my best life.
I'm thinking of, are you familiar with Natalie Goldberg, who wrote a book called Writing Down the Bones?
No, but it sounds great.
It's fascinating, but she's a big proponent of writing, almost analogous to the Zen practice of sitting and what you've said. I mean, she would advocate writing without an editor hat. She said, I had to become dumb and just not dumb without making any assumptions and just write.
Yeah.
And which is sort of, I think, the key, though I still don't understand it, or I don't understand why it works, but it seems to.
Yeah, and I think the understanding part, sometimes we just have to release that, right? Like
Maybe so.
It's not required to understand why it works. I think it's just the only thing that's required is that we try it. So I'm curious to know, after the process of writing that book and really with the help of your editor, accessing this deep space of you that before then you didn't really, weren't in contact with on a regular basis. How did that change you? How did that create something new within you?
I should say that I'm by nature not particularly introspective, but with the practice of the writing and all, and in those questions asked by Morgan, I found I could be. I just don't want to go through life without understanding or without an awareness of what I'm doing and and sort of what other people are doing too. I think it's made me more acutely, probably annoying to some people, but wanting to, explore motivations and why we express what we do.
Yeah, it's almost like you get the glasses pulled off. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I've been on autopilot this whole time. And now I can start to understand the motivations behind what I was doing. And you start to be able to create what you want instead of just having knee-jerk reactions to everything.
I think there's a lot to that. I feel more, I shouldn't say in control, but more aware. And I don't want to be on autopilot. And I am a little impatient with people who are. Some people just are.
Right. And I think meeting them where they're at is what I try to do. Because I get that too. Like, oh, why can't you see it? But then remembering they're doing the best they can with what they have. That helps me. I know.
Oh, that's really very good. That's really very good, Kelly.
So why do you think that grief grows us?
Well, I think in some cases it doesn't. At one point, I'm trying to remember when this happened, but it was after John's death, or during the memorial service. The director of an art gallery in Reston, Virginia, where his photographs had been juried and they'd been on display. And she said, well, we want to have a show of some of John's photos next fall. And I was elated by that. And I thought, he'd always wanted his own show. This will be great. But I was feeling responsible for somehow trying to realize some of his unfulfilled dreams, and that was one of them. And at the time of the show, I realized that this was such a sliver of his talent, and that it wasn't the opening that he would have envisioned for himself. And then it just sort of hit me that I couldn't fulfill his dreams, that I had to have my own dreams. And so here's the question, who am I? Am I going to define myself as being John's widow or my first husband's widow, twice widowed? And if that's how I'm going to define myself, I just might as well put on those black widow's weeds that we see people in Italy and in the Middle East don. I mean, it's just, or am I going to have dreams and keep going and growing. I don't, people say, well, do you just get over the grief? And I don't think people get over things. I think they go through them and maybe put it aside, but I don't think they get over it. So you said, how do we grow?
Why do you think grief has that power to grow us?
I think it tests our strength in many ways. It tests our courage to go on. A turning point for me was after visiting the spot where I'd scattered John's ashes. And this was some months later. I had the intention of going back to a gallery in Santa Fe where we had purchased art together. But on the way, I was distracted by these whimsical-looking wild hares made of wood in the window of a folk art shop. And there was something about this wild hare that he had sort of this dangle of red and green chilies in his front paws. And I never did get back to that gallery where John and I had been. And it just sort of felt that going home with this wild hare was a turning point. I didn't know what it was. It's just that it was sort of the first, I'd taken a step to make this condo where we had lived, and we had in Santa Fe, my own. And I would never have had this hare if John were alive living there, because this is going to be where his photo studio was. But now I had the hare, and then the hare got companions. And so, I don't know, it's only in looking back that I see that as a turning point when I sort of dared to listen. Maybe that was my inner voice saying, there's something pulling you toward this wild hare.
I absolutely believe it was your inner voice. I mean, what else would it be? And something that has brought you great joy and great comfort. And you probably think of John every time you look at that. And I think what a wonderful reminder of who he was and your growth through that. And I think that brings me to another question, and that is one of identity. So you had been widowed twice in 4 years, something that one can't even begin to imagine. And so you went from wife to widow to wife to widow. How did you rediscover who you were after John's death?
Well, I think it was, I didn't really know who I was, really.
Sure.
I mean,
I'm sure it was confusing.
I didn't know. I mean, I thought, oh, no. Because we'd had so many, such big dreams together. And to me, it was a stunning loss. But slowly, when I started writing, before life interfered, I had a plan to write a book. I was going to write a book when I retired about women between the ages of 60 and 90 who feel good about themselves. But life interfered, so I ended up writing a memoir. And it was a long process. And it's actually so, now if you're traveling to another country and they ask, what are you? You have to fill out those forms on the plane. And I just put writer. That's my identity. And it happened because of life and death. And now I have another memoir in mind that I would like to start once I can become quiet enough to really do it and listen to my inner voice. But I don't know that I've really answered your question about how did I discover who I am. I think I'm so many things, and I'm part of the grief. It's part of me. It's part of my life experience. but doesn't define me.
Right. Yeah. Have you figured out a way to find gratitude in your grief?
As opposed to, say, anger.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I'm very grateful because the question has come up. And, if I had known about John's, that he had so little time left, would I have married him? And I really can't answer that. But I am so really grateful for the time that we did have together. I mean, it was relatively short. We crammed in a lot, but it was so gratifying at the time. And even when in the last 9 months, I mean, when the news kept getting worse and worse, I held on. I held out hope for the longest time. I mean, probably, well past what someone else might have. But I thought he could beat this. And I sort of thought he did too. But he opted against the last possible chemo treatment that he might have had because he said, I wanted this. He says, I know the side effects. I know the possible implications of this. And he said, I want this to be our last best time together. And so we did have a last best time, even knowing that it was not going to last very long. Mm. So I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for that and for the other part of the time we had. I'm grateful for the time we had together.
Do you think that you've been able also to find gratitude in what your grief has taught you, in how to connect with your inner voice and how to be introspective and how to understand who you are?
Oh, that's a good question. As a person, I think I'm much more aware of others and what they may be going through in terms of grief. I was very moved at a recent reading when a young woman with a 3-month-old baby in her arms told me that she had driven 50 miles because she had to meet me. She said, your book spoke to me. She said, my brother died of cancer 4 months ago. And she said, I've been having such a hard time with this. She said, but I felt, she says, I can't explain why. She says, but your book spoke to me. And she says, I had to meet you. And I was so touched by this that I didn't think to ask her how she found me. But a man told me that his wife had died 4 months ago, and he appreciated my being able to share my feelings about my experience. And this was at another reading. I feel like I'm a bigger person and with much more empathy for other people and what they may be going through than I was.
Yeah. And I think too, what's coming up for me is this idea that this book that you wrote that's touching people's lives would never have existed had it not been what you went through, and had it not been your courage to sit down and say, I need to figure this out. I need to understand it. And I'm grateful for that. I mean, I'm grateful that you could do that.
Well, the funny thing is, someone who interviewed me said, has it occurred to you that you said, she said, you said you wanted to write a book about women between the ages of 60 and 90 who felt good about themselves. She says, has it occurred to you that you might be one of those persons that you might have wanted to interview? Mm-hmm. I said, no, it never occurred to me. But now that, I think about it, I think I said, it's possible. Yeah. It's possible.
Yeah, I love that. And I am curious now, after all of this, where do you find yourself in life now? What does your life look like now?
Oh, I'm very happily settled in the village of Galisteo with my third husband, a widower. And we met just through well-intended female friends, just as I was completing the first draft of my book. And we've been married 5-6 years. I'm thinking, because my book really was an 8-year project. I mean, it was 3 years writing the first draft and another 3 rewriting. And then I did have an agent and a year to find a publisher. And then this past year, just making it a tangible book in hand. So I married Frank, and who has been so sincerely supportive of my writing. And it was, at times I felt, I was giving so much to the book that I wasn't giving enough to our relationship, but then sort of worked it out so that, daytimes I'm involved with the writing and related efforts. And he has things that he does too that are separate. But then we're together in the evenings and on the weekends. And I didn't have a family. I never had children before. I had married 2 men without children. I didn't have children. And with Frank, I acquired an instant family, 3 grown children and 6 grandchildren. And it was an adjustment for everyone.
I'm sure.
But it's been enriching to me and for me. So I'm grateful.
I have a question for you in that after your heartbreak of losing John and your first husband, was it scary for you to say, I'm going to try this one more time?
What my concern was, I liked the idea of sharing my life with someone, but I was very concerned that it be the right person. It was a process. I mean, I didn't know. I didn't just set out. I was so focused on doing the book, writing the book, that meeting someone else was not in the forefront of my mind. But I thought that if I did, it would have to be the right person. And I just really couldn't visualize who that might be. And when Frank and I first met, it was not a good first meeting. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to see this man again. Well, it's a whole little story in itself, but I'm glad we overcame that.
Right. Well, I'm glad for you. I'm so happy to know that you are living a life that is full of family and love, and that you've really been able to take this grief and turn it into something so beautiful.
I'm very happy, very happy with all of that, because it might have been different. I don't, we never know.
Yeah.
But I do think that it was a risk, but I've always had sort of an adventurous streak. And I think some risks are worth taking. And I'm glad I did. I'm glad I did with Frank.
Awesome.
I mean, I've got to say, he's older than I. I met his mother, who died at the age of 102. And she was in great shape. So, I thought that was reassuring that she was going strong for so long.
Yes, good genes.
Yes.
So Shirley, I have one last question for you today.
Yes, Kelly.
And that is, what is your inner voice telling you right now in your life, or about what's next, or about whatever?
It's telling me, and I think it's been telling me for a long time, to make the most of every moment. Seize the day, the carpe diem. And also, I'm feeling that my connection with you this morning is very gratifying. And I'd like to offer you, I have a friend who's a ceramicist. She teaches ceramics to students, high school students in Los Angeles, and she sent me a box of banged up hearts, these beautiful hearts, sort of this luscious red. And then on the back side, it has my name and the year. But I would love to send one of these to you.
Oh, Shirley,
if I could.
That. Oh my goodness, yes, I would love that so much. And what you don't know is we're recording this today on my birthday. So,
oh my,
what a wonderful gift! Yes, I would love that very much. And I think that what that really makes me reflect upon is that we all have a banged up heart. Like we all have those hurts and that grief and those moments where we miss the people that we thought we would be with. And I think that if we can all learn from you and understand that our grief can be a tool to grow us, our grief can be something to help us connect with our inner voice on a deeper level, our grief can teach us, we will learn something new about who we are, just like you did. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
You're so welcome, Kelly. Thank you for this opportunity.
You're welcome. And best of luck with all of your books that are to come.
Thank you.
Isn't she just wonderful? I was so happy to get to know her, and I did receive my banged up heart, and it's on my piano in my studio, and I just love it. And I just love connecting with women who are understanding the importance of connecting and living by our inner voice. And that's what this podcast is all about, you guys. I love what she was saying about the power of actually sitting down with pen and paper versus typing into the computer, and how there's something about that that just releases and like helps us access that deeper level of consciousness. I really believe in the power of that. And then the whole concept of understanding the gratitude that comes inside of grief to help us learn from that, to help us transform through that. To me, that was such a powerful concept and idea. And I think that embracing that, not just in grief, but embracing that in every part of our life, really is going to just open up so many possibilities for us and open up so much love and beauty and peace and excitement in our lives. So many possibilities there. So I really hope that you're able to take what Shirley said and apply it in your life in some way, even if it's not the exact same grief that you're feeling. And I really feel that we can all take what she said and apply it in a way that makes sense to us. As always, I want to thank all of you, each and every one of you, for being here today, for pressing play, for saying, I am worthy. It means so much to me, and it means so much to our world, to everyone in it, to everyone in your world. When they see you standing in your worth, when they see you listening to your inner voice and being aligned with your soul's true purpose. And you know that that is the message that In Her Voice is bringing to women each and every day. And I'm so excited to tell you that this is the third month. So In Her Voice was released May 12th. And we're coming into the end of July, into the beginning of August. And every single month since In Her Voice has been released, we are getting more and more listens, more and more downloads. And that's because of you, because you're sharing, because you're telling your friends, because you're telling your girlfriends and your sisters and your mothers and your neighbors and maybe even your dads and your husbands, how important this message is. And I really just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And also give you an opportunity to support In Her Voice at an even deeper level. As you know, there are costs associated with producing and hosting this podcast, and I really want to be able to create some sustainability in my podcast, create a way for me to get support and help with the things that I need. And the only way that I can do that is through your support. And so when you join with me in supporting In Her Voice in a financial way, maybe that's $1, maybe it's $5, maybe it's $10 a month, that helps me reach more people. It helps me free up my time that I spend writing show notes and editing and all of those things, so I can really get at the heart of what I feel my purpose is, and that is to get this message of worthiness out. If you really want to stand with me in supporting In Her Voice, in supporting this message of worthiness and listening to our inner voice, I ask you to head on over to my Patreon page, kellycovert.com/together. And you can also find the link in whatever podcast app that you're listening to right in the description there. And head on over there and you can choose to support on a monthly basis at whatever you feel your heart is telling you to do. And I just want to thank you so much for doing that, for being with me on this. As always, I want to remind you, you are worthy, you are loved, you are needed in this world. Go out and be you.